Hey everyone, welcome back. I am so excited you're joining me for today's explainer because we have got something truly mind-bending to unpack. We're looking at a brand new, completely counterintuitive study published in Nature Medicine, and it is fundamentally challenging how we think about the future of healthcare tech. If you've been paying any attention to the AI boom, everyone is racing to build the ultimate AI for doctors. And the promise is massive, right? Curing physician burnout, perfectly transcribing patient notes, diagnosing rare diseases in the blink of an eye. And because the stakes in healthcare are just incredibly high, the assumption has always been that we absolutely need bespoke, highly specialized tools built exclusively for the medical field. But today, we're going to look at some independent data that literally flips the script on everything we thought we knew about medical AI. So get ready, because this is a deep dive you definitely don't want to miss.
So let's just get right into it by asking the core question here. Does an AI built exclusively for doctors actually make a better doctor? I mean, it feels like a total no-brainer, right? Common sense tells us that a custom-built tool for a highly technical job is obviously going to outperform some general-purpose tool. You wouldn't use a Swiss Army knife to perform open-heart surgery. But in the wild world of large language models, common sense is currently getting stress-tested by hard data. Today we're putting that exact assumption under the microscope to see what really happens when the numbers come in.
Now, to really grasp why this matters, let's briefly set the stakes. Right now, as we speak, massive hospitals and health systems are pouring unprecedented amounts of money into buying proprietary, specialized clinical AI tools. And they're doing this mostly without robust, independent evidence. They're just operating on the assumption that a specialized medical AI will naturally crush a general off-the-shelf AI like ChatGPT or Google Gemini. And look, it totally makes sense why administrators think this way. They're terrified about HIPAA compliance, strict patient privacy, institutional liability. They genuinely believe they're buying guaranteed safety and enhanced accuracy by going specialized. But is that actually what the data shows when we put these systems head-to-head?
Okay, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The AI Healthcare Showdown. 2. Meet the contenders. 3. The three-stage stress test. 4. The surprising data results. 5. Safety, clarity, and refusals. And 6. The verdict for medicine.
All right, part 1, the AI Healthcare Showdown.
The urgency around testing these tools, it honestly cannot be overstated. Specialized clinical AIs are already out there in the wild, entering medical practice at an incredible scale, helping doctors every single day. But since their architectures and training data are completely locked down and proprietary, doctors and hospitals are basically just having to trust the marketing brochures. There's been this massive, pressing need for independent quantitative evaluation. And that brings us to the study we're digging into today, led by researcher Krithik Viswanathan and a huge team of experts, and published in the highly prestigious journal Nature Medicine. To get what they did, we first have to define general-purpose AI. These are the models trained on a massive chunk of the entire internet. We're talking everything from Wikipedia decoding manuals to your grandma's cooking recipes. They aren't just reading medical textbooks. Now, the researchers absolutely did not bury the lead here. They completely spoiled the conclusion right in the title. General-purpose large language models outperform specialized clinical AI tools on medical benchmarks. That is an incredibly bold finding, and it's exactly what we're going to dissect. How on earth did the general models win?
Moving on to part 2. Meet the contenders.
To understand how this massive upset happened, let's look at the two radically different philosophies stepping into the ring. On one side, we have the general AI models. These guys rely on absolutely massive, general-purpose training corpora and extensive alignment. Basically, they are trained to be pretty darn good at almost everything. On the other side, we have these specialized clinical AI tools. These rely on domain-specific training or something called retrieval augmented generation, often just called RAG. To put it simply, think of RAG like an AI that has its own private, built-in search engine that's restricted strictly to verified medical literature and textbooks. Instead of relying on its vast internet-sized memory, it actively looks up the correct medical answer in a specialized library before it talks to you. So it's the ultimate battle of general vastness versus specialized focus.
Let's check out the starting lineup so we know exactly what generation of tech we're dealing with. In the general-purpose LLM corner, we've got the absolute heavyweights from this testing period. OpenAI's GPT 5.2, Google Gemini 3.1 Pro Preview, and Anthropic's Claude Opus 4.6. Going up against them in the specialized column, we've got Open Evidence and UpToDate Expert AI, both highly respected, widely used tools built specifically for the hospital environment. And as a really brilliant control baseline, the researchers threw in the auto-enabled Google Search AI overview. This is crucial, right? Because it acts as a real-world baseline. It's the tool a physician might actually use right now if they just do a quick web search on their phone in the hallway between seeing patients.
Let's hit part 3, the 3-stage stress test.
So how exactly do you judge these fundamentally different tools fairly? The researchers knew they couldn't just ask the AI a couple of random medical trivia questions and call it a day. They needed a rigorous, multi-layered gauntlet. Step 1 is MedQA. This is 500 questions styled directly after the U.S. medical licensing examination. This tests pure, raw, textbook medical knowledge. Step 2 is HealthBench, featuring 500 clinician alignment items. What that actually means is they're measuring whether the AI reasons through a complex problem the way an expert human doctor would. Can it synthesize symptoms, prioritize the right next steps? Finally, step 3 is where it gets incredibly real. 100 live clinical queries. These weren't neat, tidy questions cooked up in a lab. These were messy, complex queries inputted by de-identified physicians during their actual daily workflows. Imagine a prompt like, hey, a 45-year-old patient presents with these 3 conflicting symptoms and this one slightly elevating weird lab result. What's the differential diagnosis? So the test scales beautifully from strict textbook exams all the way down to chaotic real-world hospital use.
And for that critical final step with the live clinical queries, they brought in the humans. 12 different U.S. clinicians stepped up to perform a randomized, blinded review of the AI's answers. And blinded is the key word here. The grading doctors had absolutely no idea which AI produced which response, so they literally couldn't play favorites. This rigorous process churned out a massive 1,800 model question annotations. Let me tell you, in the world of evaluating medical AI, 1,800 blinded expert annotations is an incredibly robust, statistically significant number. It ensures absolute impartiality in the grading process.
Okay, part 4, the surprising data results. Now, what's really interesting about this next bit of data is,
Well, let's look at the raw medical knowledge test first, the MedQA board-style exam. Talk about a massive upset. The general-purpose LLMs just swept the top 3 spots. Google Gemini 3.1 Pro absolutely led the pack, with a staggering 97.4% accuracy. GPT 5.2 was right behind at 94.2%, and Claude Opus 4.6 hit 90.2%. And the specialized clinical AI tools, the ones built just for this, they actually fell straight to the bottom of the pack. Open Evidence scored 89.6%, and UpToDate scored 88.4%. I really want to pause and just let that data breathe for a second. An 8 or 9% gap in accuracy on a medical licensing exam is huge. When you're in a real-world setting, operating at scale across an entire health system, that gap translates to thousands of correct answers versus thousands of potentially missed opportunities. The generalists literally beat the specialists at their own exam.
But hey, pure knowledge is just one piece of the puzzle, right? A medical textbook has perfect knowledge, but a textbook can't treat a patient. You also have to think like a doctor. So let's move to the HealthBench scores. Remember, this tests if the AI aligns with how an expert clinician actually reasons through a diagnosis or a treatment plan. Look at this gap. It actually widens significantly here. GPT 5.2 scores a massive 88.0. Gemini hits 79.3. But Open Evidence, it drops all the way down to 62.6, and UpToDate was right there with it at 61.3. When it actually comes down to clinically aligning with how an expert doctor processes information, the general frontier models were vastly superior to the tools custom-built for that exact purpose. It's wild.
So, what happened in the final round? Those messy, live queries reviewed by actual blinded doctors? The results were definitive. The researchers mathematically accounted for something called rater leniency, which basically means they adjusted the math so that doctors who are generally super easy graders or overly harsh graders wouldn't skew the final results. But even after that adjustment, the clinical AI tools and the Google search baseline, by the way, had 49 to 87% lower odds of receiving a higher rating than Gemini. Let that sink in for a minute. When actual, real-life doctors evaluated the usefulness of the answers for real patient scenarios, the odds were massively stacked against the specialized medical tools.
which brings us to part 5, safety, clarity, and refusals.
Because, as we all know, in healthcare, getting the correct answer is literally only half the battle. How that information is delivered and whether it's actually safe to use is paramount. The study found that the clinical tools didn't just struggle with raw accuracy, they struggled with basic communication. Open Evidence actually scored the lowest of all the models on clarity, with a mean score of just 2.84 out of 5. The physician reviewers noted that it frequently suffered from incomplete clinical content, safety-critical omissions, and just generally disorganized responses. Turns out, a specialized tool's greatest weakness in this test was often its ability to clearly and safely communicate its findings back to a very busy physician.
And this brings us to a really staggering number in the data. 19%. Up-to-date AI flat-out refused to answer 19% of the real clinical queries. It just threw up its hands and provided zero help. By comparison, the general frontier models only had a refusal rate of about 1 to 3%. To put that into perspective, imagine paging a specialist in the hospital for a quick consult, and 1 out of every 5 times you call, they just hang up the phone on you. That is essentially what a 19% refusal rate looks like in practice. If you are a slammed clinician in a busy emergency room, you simply cannot rely on a workflow tool that just refuses to help you that frequently. It just doesn't work.
Now, the primary defense for specialized clinical AI is usually safety. That's the go-to argument, right? The idea is that because they are tightly constrained to verified medical texts, they won't hallucinate or provide dangerous advice like a wide-open general AI might. But the data here, it just doesn't support that assumption. Here's what the study found directly. Quote, "None of the models produced more harmful content or hallucinations than any of the others."
So yeah, as the data shows, the safety outcomes were practically identical across the board. The specialized models simply did not provide any protective advantage when it came to safety or hallucination rates. They weren't any safer than ChatGPT, Gemini, or Claude. They essentially tied on the metric of not doing active harm, but as we've clearly seen across all the previous tests, they lost big time on accuracy, clinical alignment, and clarity.
All right, final section, Part 6, the verdict for MedQA.
Let's bring all this dense, fascinating data back down to earth. What is the real-world impact here? Well, the core takeaways are incredibly clear. Across all 3 rigorous stages of evaluation, the general, off-the-shelf frontier LLMs heavily outperform the specialized clinical AI tools. General AI dominates in raw medical knowledge. It dominates in alignment with expert clinician judgment, and it dominates in actual preference by blinded doctors reviewing real clinical queries. Astonishingly, the highly expensive clinical AI tools basically only performed comparably to a standard auto-enabled Google search AI overview. Remember those hospital administrators we talked about at the very beginning? The ones spending millions on specialized systems without independent data? Well, this research highlights exactly why independent, real-world evaluation of these tools is absolutely crucial before we rush to integrate them into actual clinical settings.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative question to end on. If the massive scale and vast training data of general AI already allows it to outperform bespoke, specialized medical tools today, who should be responsible for independently evaluating the AI that's going to be guiding our doctors in hospitals tomorrow? We obviously can't just rely on assumptions or slick marketing materials anymore. We need rigorous, hard data, exactly like this incredible Nature Medicine study provided. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning the data, keep learning, and I will see you in the next explainer.